on my other computer, but I've got to leave at 3 or
Okay.
6, I guess.
Okay. 17 December. Um, Stuff that can be replayed at your leisure. Yesterday we had a little kind of sound issue. I did want to show, ultimately, as I've done before, is to show the Andy Higginbottom lectures on Toto, just because, it's a good place to sort of find it. And this is the ultimate, not the penultimate, but the ultimate, the lecture 10 of the volume 2, Marx Capital Volume 2 series. And uh, it's worth listening to, particularly because he wants to introduce his own sort of research interests, which include the Global South and some of the current stuff that's actually really important in looking at how it applies to or it extends certain notions about dependency theory and a variety of other things that are important for developmental studies. So let's see if we can get the sound to work properly. If it works this time and we don't get any glitches, we'll proceed with that. I have it set at 1.25 speed because Andy speaks slowly. And also, if it doesn't work, we'll switch to a session at the Royal Geographical Society between Yanis Varoufakis and Slavoj Žižek. Say that 10 times. So something will be shown one way or the other. Otherwise, you have me yakking, and that may or may not be a good thing. So let's try this first one and see whether we're going to get this to work.
Remind ourselves, particularly in what's happening in the world today, how she was very much saw violence as being integral to the very nature of the capitalist system. The issue with Luxemburg is just her theoretical explanation from it, that the intention was.
Gosh darn it. Ah, man.
I could see it, and it sounded good.
Is the sound good?
Yeah, it was when it was running.
Seemed to be working
Okay.
fine.
Let me start from the beginning.
Volume 2, Part 3. This is really just a prompt as a reminder. So Marx looks at the totality of the capitalist mode of production from the perspective of the movement of commodity capital and commodities. And in very broad terms, the commodities are either those that are consumed in the capitalist production itself, or they're consumed by the workers. They have to buy them and they use them to live, basically, or they're consumed by the capitalists. So what we've got here is 3 broad categories of how commodities are used, their use value. Now, they're not down to the level of particular sectors. We're not talking about, we can exemplify with frozen peas and biscuits, if you like, for the workers, and private jets for the capitalist consumption. But the categories themselves are quite broad. Okay, so we're talking about the category of all the things that the workers might consume to live, and all the things that capitalists might use to produce more in the next round of production, if you like. Okay, so there's 3 broad categories, really. Okay. Now, the issue here is that this is not just about the markets, it's about the way markets work to reproduce capitalist social relations in the capitalist mode of production. So what's particular about this is that the workers and the capitalists relate to each other from this perspective as buyers and sellers. But of course, because their markets, it's not only about commodities, it's also about money, because there's always this exchange. It's not quite, you can't have a market economy without the correlation between the movement of money with the movement of the commodities. So what is quite important, if you look at the titles that Marx uses, he talks about the reproduction of capital through circulation, through the movement of money. Okay, now how this fits into Marx's overall design is it really is the bringing to a head, the highest point, I think, in Capital, of the distinction between use values and exchange values, because he's looking at how they interact on a social scale. So we're talking about circulation. We know in volume 1 he's looked in very in the essence in the production of surplus value. And what he's doing here is he's looking at circulation as it exists based on that platform which he's already established. And what he's also doing in part 3 of volume 2 is he's looking at the circulation based on categories of distinction that arise from the social relations of production. So of course the most important one from volume 1 is the distinction between constant and variable capital, and what he draws from the early parts of volume 2 is the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. So he's predicating the movement in circulation based on those categories. The interesting thing about this perspective of the totality is the perspective is that of industrial capital producing commodities, consuming commodities, reproducing itself. But what it also does is it shows how if you like, the spontaneous movement of industrial capital generates within the system the requirement for a credit system as well. He's sort of in and out on the credit system quite a lot. So there's some points here about how this fits with volumes 1 and 3 basically. So what we have is some resonance with the themes of volume 1, in particular the general law of accumulation, because we're talking about a totality of reproduction of class relations. But this level of analysis also has a limit, right, which Marx does not apply here the degree of dynamic in the system, which he does do with the general law of accumulation, which is this question of increasing productivity and the role that the rising organic composition of capital has in driving the system forward. So I think this is quite an important point in terms of just locating how far Marx gets with this mode of analysis and how much still needs to be sort of thought through. So what I think really is what you get with these departments of production is the possibility of crisis. There's disproportionalities, potentially there's shortages, bottlenecks, and various sort of points of instability, but it's still not a very strong and imperative necessity of the system as a whole to go into crisis. And so there's something else, there's something missing here, and that's what something missing is why we need to study further volume. That's summary in terms of capital, but also go back to Rosa Luxemburg from the last lecture and her contribution. Her contribution was very significant politically. She was an outstanding opponent of the violence of imperialism, and in fact, gave her life in that struggle. So it's important to remind ourselves, particularly in what's happening in the world today, how she was very much saw violence as being integral to the very nature of the capitalist system. The issue with Luxemburg is just her theoretical explanation from it, that the intention was absolutely right. But what we looked at is that she explains the need for capital to expand into non-capitalist economies and societies. But she's also aware, and this is what I've highlighted here, it's not only the need for capitalism to export commodities into non-capitalist societies or surplus products, but also the means of production and labor power are also part of the imperialist relationship. I mean, the critique of Luxemburg is she doesn't really explain that, but I mean, she's very aware of it and she's very opposed to it. Okay. And once again, we've got this role of political violence. So I think, an all-rounded assessment of Luxemburg, she's in this sort of like the top level of contributions to our tradition. And it's very welcome that her works have been now produced. And I'd like to thank Tim for drawing how they're different in Poland to how they are in Russia. So she was already at quite a young age an accomplished Marxist theoretician. Okay, and she drew particular political conclusions from her analysis, which was debated quite a lot in the movement, right? But she didn't think it was worth Poland fighting for national self-determination because of the degree of economic integration with the Russian capitalism. But what I learned from these collective works is how Luxemburg she was an educator. She worked in the SDB party school for about 15 years, I think, for at least 10 years. And in these collected works, we have translations of the lectures she gave about volume 2, and I mean they're quite she knew her stuff. She really had tried to explain what was happening, in particular turnover times, for example. But I actually do think she makes a mistake here. But it's not only her mistake, it's a very common mistake. So if you remember, on turnover times, there'll be a difference between industries like producing steam engines, which might take about a year or two to produce an actual steam engine. That's in the nature of the complicated product that's being produced. You compare that with, say, cotton spinning, and the cotton that's spun, the product can come out almost daily. It can be sold very quickly. The production and selling cycle can be quite short. So there's a sort of a difference in the structure of the two industries. That means that the capital spent in cotton spinning, a lot of it will come back as money when the goods are sold much more quickly than they will if the capital invested in the steam industry. Now, so the turnover time is quicker, which means that less capital needs to be advanced to start making a profit. Now, that doesn't mean to say that all the investors in steam engines will divert their investments into cotton spinning, which is what basically Luxembourg is saying here, right? Actually, what happens is that the prices of steam engines are adjusted spontaneously to take this into effect. And what I'm going to keep doing is keep giving you big pointers forward towards volume 3, because that's actually how Marx explains it in volume 3. Again, Luxembourg has read volume 3. She gave lectures on it to workers in Germany in the early 20th century. And again, I think that she's got a fairly conventional reading of it, and again, conventional mistakes, I have to say. She does comment on the falling rate of profit, but interestingly, and this is one of her particular characteristics as a theoretician, she doesn't really connect the falling rate of profit with a tendency to crisis. And finally, I mean, when she was in prison, she wrote a short essay which was included in Franz Mehring's book, which is a very important biography of Marx. It was the most important biography of Marx for quite a long time in the first half of the 20th century. And she gave, she was included as a theoretical contributor to that. Okay, there's just one more thing about Rosa and Marx. And in one of her notes about Marx's Capital, she draws attention to something which I think is extremely important that we're aware of as well. And this comes from chapter 11 of volume 3. And the reason I'm pointing forward to this is because it affects what we understand from here on in, basically. And in this chapter, Marx discusses, and Luxembourg is explaining this, what happens if there's a general rise in wages. There's a differential effect on those industries or those sectors which have got high number of workers for the capital invested compared to the capital intensive industries. And if wages rise, then those branches where the outlays for variable capital are lower than the outlays for constant capital, prices will fall. Okay. Now this is the important thing here is what she's drawing attention to, although she doesn't bring out the point fully in the way that I think helps us a lot, is the converse is also true, right? And this is if wages fall, then the prices of production for commodities where capitals are higher than average, right, will actually rise. And that's a counterintuitive result. But if wages fall in general, it means that profits in general will rise. But because where the capital is sectors where capital is highly capital intensive, because the general rate of profit is risen, then their prices of production will rise even more than they have done already. So that turns out to be an extremely important result in terms of understanding imperialism. And I'll come back to this in slightly different ways as we go through. So this is Rosa right. Now this is Marx writing. Sorry, a fall in wages is thus only possible here, either if wages previously stood above the normal price or if they are now to be pushed below it. So all I'm saying is that what Rosa Luxemburg has touched on here is something which is extremely important. She didn't really develop this, but it's very helpful that she draws attention to it, right? Because actually it's extremely important for thinking about how Marx's Capital applies as a theory of imperialism. And the other thing I just point out here is at this stage, Marx is talking about a general fluctuation in wages. He's not distinguishing between some workers having lower wages and some having higher. But the effect that he's talking about here is if wages in general go up or general go down. Okay, so that's kind of like my review part. That's part 1 of 3. I now want to go into Grossman's contribution, and I did this last time, but I'll just roll this forward to Grossman. Henrik Grossman is slightly unusual in this sequence, I think, because he fits between two main theoretical generations. He was writing in the 1920s, late 1920s was his most productive period. And what Grossman's contribution is he shifts the focus of discussion away from part 3 of volume 2 into volume 3 and the question of profit, which is discussed, explained in volume 3. So Grossman is an important theoretical bridge to the generation of the 1970s. And the generation 1970s, from my point of view anyway, our point of view is particularly the Marxist theory of dependency, which changes the overall view once more. Okay, so I just want to locate where Grossman fits. He had a very challenging life, I have to say, and very sadly his wife and son were killed. They were murdered in the Holocaust, basically, because he had been separated from them because of his constant imprisonment. The Communist Party he joined in Poland in the 1920s was effectively illegal, and he was persecuted both for being Jewish and being a communist in Poland before even Hitler came to power in Germany. But when he moved out of Poland to Germany in 1925, up until 1933, he was linked with the Frankfurt School. He was the only economist in the Frankfurt School. And this was his most important and productive period, I think, actually. And there's been a resurgence in recent years, a welcome return of interest in, particularly Rick Kuhn has written quite a lot about both his life and his work. And his works are being published. Now, Grossman takes a much kinder view of Sismondi. If you remember this whole discussion of Sismondi between Lenin's view, Marx's view, and Luxemburg's view, he's actually goes back to Sismondi, and he has a kind supportive view of Sismondi as a theoretician. He's saying, look, Sismondi's known for having a moral critique, an ethical critique of capitalism that is very unequal in its distribution of income. But he's saying that actually Sismondi was more than that. He gave a theoretical advance, which was after Keynes' Tableau Économique and before Marx's reproduction schema. And the content of that advance is what I'll put here is these 3 branches of production. So he's beginning to separate out industrial production from workers' consumption and luxury consumption. So it's a very sympathetic sort of renovation of Sismondi, I would say. As it happens, as Grossman got a bit older, he was not actually in the Communist Party in the 1930s, but he was sympathetic to it, and he slightly became more critical. At least that's how Paul Zahn-Becker, who is a Luxemburgist, I would say, writes it, that Grossman sort of slightly gravitated towards the more orthodox position, which was a stronger critique from Lenin of Sismondi. Now, this one is methodologically interesting. If you're interested about the structure of Marx's Capital, this work written in 1929 is quite a significant one, and it sits alongside Rostolsky's discussion of exactly this point, right? And it's also come through with Heinrich's discussion, which is what is the significance of Marx deciding he couldn't get through 6 books and he was going to write 3 books. And it's not just a matter of numbers here. According to Grossman, at least, Marx rethinks the whole structure at this point, which is about 1863. And what's interesting about this is what Grossman brings out is the structure of the 3 books corresponds to the functions of industrial capital. I mean, we looked at this quite a lot in volume 2. We've got the production process, the circulation process, the process as a whole. The 3 volumes correspond to the 3 forms of capital as it goes through its circuit. Okay. Grossman thought that this was triggered by Marx's work on the reproduction scheme, but I'm not sure he's right about that, I have to say, because I think the real trigger was Marx's work on prices of production. Why does that matter? It seems very sort of nerdy, technical. Once again, it's about the theoretical structure connecting volumes 2 and 3, and where the sort of significant arguments are actually need to be located, what level of abstraction or what perspective they get located at. So Marx's definitely did change his approach. But the last point from methodology from Grossman is that Grossman often puts this is influential, by the way, the current generation of Marxists. Many of the interpreters of Marxist methodology adopt the Grossman sort of approach, which is this idea of successive approximations from a highly abstract one to a more concrete one in terms of the movement in the 3 books of Capital. That is, as a generality, quite right, but it actually also misses something, which is the influence of Hegel in Marx's structure. Marx's rethought structure has a very strong influence in terms of how the movement goes from the immediate appearance to the essence, to the explained and actual appearance. And so it's not just a simply matter of more and more concrete, it's a matter of the actual internal structure and the external as essence and the external appearance. So production, circulation, essence and appearance is the dialectic which I do think that Grossman slightly misses. Okay, so this is Grossman's main work. He's got a sympathetic evaluation of Luxembourg. Certainly the tone is far better and less, what's the word, polemic in a factional sense than was written by Bukharin. And he's also critiquing Bauer. I won't go into this in any detail, except to say this. His evaluation is that Luxembourg's good intent didn't succeed. Why? Because it's not rooted in the immanent laws of the accumulation process. He argues that Luxembourg shifts a crucial problem of capitalism from the sphere of production to that of circulation. And so he's trying to bring it back into production, and we'll see how he does it. So this is his main work, The Law of Capitalist Breakdown is the subtitle. And you can see from the graph, which is from his book, the basic idea of a cycle of expansion, growth, and then crisis and retraction, recession. And it just sort of goes in a ratchet effect. And the crucial vector, which Grossman brings out, is the question of profit. The profitability is that which is the index of expansion or not. Okay. This is a quote from Kuhn, and as Kuhn says, he's bringing out the logic of capitalist production. In actual fact, once again, I'm going to put my slight caveat on this, is actually the combination of production and circulation, which we see in volume 3. It's not just production, it's how they combine it in reality, right? Now then, Grossman's got two categories of modifying counter tendencies. The first are the internal ones, and the second are the overseas ones, the external ones, right? And he goes through a whole list of ways in which capital can restore its profitability. In actual fact, I'm quoting here from Kuhn's summary of Grossman's argument. In actual fact, he doesn't talk about wage cuts. It's quite interesting. If you get the opportunity to read Grossman's explanation, I think he's actually a bit missing actually the degree of crisis in a way. Okay. But what he does do is he connects the crisis of profitability with capitalism's external dynamic, if you like, or a dynamic to subordinate from Western Europe or United States, other parts of the world within the capitalist system. Now, this one is, we're going to pause a bit on this. I want you to try and sort of assimilate it a little bit, right? The figures that Grossman uses come from Marx. They come from chapter 8 of volume 3 of Capital, right? And this is a big anticipation of reading volume 3. So you don't have to get all of this now. It's just to get an idea of what the issues are, okay? Now, what Marx is doing is he's saying that workers in Asia are less exploited than workers in Europe, okay? So you can see this example of Asia, the relation between variable capital and surplus value is that the surplus value is only 25% of the variable capital. Okay, so this is the C plus V plus S, that the total value of the commodities is 121. And he contrasts this with workers' situation in Western Europe. Oh, so rate of surplus value 25%, and the rate of profit, which is 21 over 100. Okay, so this is one case. This is from Grossman's thinking through what Marx is saying in the text at this point. Okay, he's just drawing out something from Marx. And this is the situation in Europe, according to these figures. Workers are exploited at a degree of 100%, but there's fewer workers because more of the money is invested in the machinery and the raw materials. Okay, so the actual rate of profit is lower, even though the rate of surplus value is higher. Now, Marx's transformation is he puts these two together, or this is a simulation of Marx's transformation, and adds up a total and works out what the average rate of surplus value, that's not important, the average rate of profit would be across these two regions, right? So you get total of 37 surplus value, total invested 200. So the rate of profit is 18.5%. Now, this is a simulation of Marx's price of production procedure. If the rate of profit is the same in Asia as it is in Europe, despite the differences in the production side, if it gets equalized, then the prices of production of the commodities in Asia are actually lower than their simple values, and the prices of production of the commodities produced in Europe are actually higher than their simple values, not by a great amount, because what we've in effect got in these numbers is sort of two counteracting pressures. Okay, but this is the argument that Grossman is taking from Marx. So he's being quite literal. He's following Marx's figures from chapter 8. And this is the commodities of the advanced capitalist country with a higher organic composition will therefore be sold at prices of production higher than their values. Those of the backward country, excuse the language, but there we are, at prices of production lower than their values. And this is explaining an unequal exchange. What this means is that there's some commodities are being sold below their values, and there's on the other hand, some are being sold above their values, according to the region in which the workers produced them. Okay, now this happens to be extremely important in terms of theory of imperialism. There's two critiques of Grossman's explanation, because what he's doing is he's moving towards from capital to imperialism, if you like, right? Mandel's critique I did find quite surprising in a way, right? But he doesn't like this, what he thinks is a monocausal explanation at all. And also, Mandel actually reverts more to Luxemburg's volume 2 sort of circulation based explanation. Now he has got a point, which is, and we'll come to this as well, right, which is in actual fact, if you have a new totality, then of course it should be reflected both at the aspect of analysis which we've got in volume 1, which is the general law of accumulation. It would be reflected in some way in the departments of production, but there is this question of where does the determinacy come from, right? So it would also be reflected in a question of profitability in the volume 3 sort of aspect. And the other critique of Grossman's explanation, really the source of it is Marxist dependency theory. I'm not sure, apart from Marini, how many of the 1970s Marxists had read Grossman. I'm pretty sure Marini had. There's also, to what extent is it also our critique, certainly mine, perhaps hopefully yours as well, right? So Grossman was right to focus on these prices of production profitability, especially when it comes to international exchange as a way in which value is transferred. I mean, that was an advance, absolutely right. But the figures he takes from Marx were quite misleading against the reality of this is a little in joke, combined and yet uneven reality, because in reality there's a greater exploitation of workers in the backward countries. That's the dependency theory, Marxist dependency theory thesis, right? And there's also a question about how much profit rates do get equalized, and this is where the questions of monopoly come in, right? So Grossman again was an advance in the sense that he was right to look at the transformation of simple values into prices of production, but what he didn't go deeply into is that the formation of profits is based on living labor. So it's not only a matter of capital accumulation and imperialism, it's a matter of how the efforts of workers as living labor are represented in the imperialist prices of production. Okay, so that's what I'm going to move on to shortly. Again, this is a big anticipation, but you could look at Marx's example as rendered by Grossman differently. You could look at how it works with same degree of exploitation. So the Asian workers are exploited to the same degree as the European workers. The only difference here is that there's more workers for the capital invested, and in Europe there's more means of production invested in for each 100 invested, right? So this is actually close to Marx's actual solution, because in his solution the rate of surplus value is the same in different sectors. But even here this is what's assumed by many theoreticians today as sufficient explanation for unequal exchange, which is basically the only difference is in the composition of capital between the two sectors. But I also think if we come closer to the reality today, we can say, no, well, let's say that workers in Asia are more exploited than workers in Europe, and then you get an even further deviation of prices of production from what they would be if they were represented by their simple values. Okay, commodities were represented by their simple values. So what I'm saying is that this is quite a good way of explaining, in actual fact, the unequal exchange. It is, and John's book definitely uses many examples of the inequality in the world production today. Okay, and it's well known. These are not secrets. For basically the same type of work, Asian workers more often than not paid less than a quarter of what European workers would get for the same job, same technology, same everything, except their conditions of reward. Okay, so that's Grossman. And now thirdly, I want to come on to Marini. I'm just going to check the time. I think we're right. Marini's further on, again, both from Luxemburg and from Grossman, right? So basically what Luxemburg argued was on the basis of these two departments, there was the need for new demand from outside the relation of capitalists and workers. They needed to have something else which provided the demand, right? Now, what Marini's basic position is actually it can be inside, but it's different. It's different relationship of departments of production, whether you're in Africa or in Europe or Africa or Europe and Latin America. Okay, so what he's doing is he's bringing in a distinct division of labor between the two regions of the world, okay, between the imperialist countries and the subordinated countries within the capitalist system. So there's a contradiction, which his sort of main focal point, starting point for this argument is within the sort of mid-19th century free trade capitalism, which was also Marx's period. I mean, this is what Marx was mostly writing about. And he's saying it wasn't just capitalism, this was already free trade imperialism. And so we've got the leading example. So, now that doesn't preclude, by the way, other pathways, other sort of experiences of coloniality from Western Europe, United States, and so on. But this one is the Marini's focus, and I do think it's quite broadly, generally applicable to the global South. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly because this is for you, those of you who've studied Marini, you know this already. The point that he's making is that there's a greater exploitation of the worker in the global South, and that's the way capitalism sort of tends to operate. Emphasis on this. I mean, there's also obviously all workers produce and they have productivity, but there's an emphasis on the greater exploitation. And he talks about super exploitation in terms of more intense work, longer working day, and effectively lower wages. And this doesn't preclude productivity at all. It's just the emphasis of how capitalism works in Latin America and the global South. Right. So, I mean, I've argued, and again, I'm just going to do this very quickly, that this is an advance on Marx's theory of surplus value. Marini was very conscious, I think, dialectics of dependency, which we now have in English, he's saying, you know, this is a fourth thing. This is another dimension of surplus value, right? And it's a qualitative as well as quantitative one. And so what he's saying is he's going beyond Marx's tendency to normalize a common rate of surplus value, and that capitalism generates inequalities within the working class, how the social relations of reproduction of the workers of labor power take place is differentiated, and that labor superexploitation is a way of increasing surplus value, right? Because it cuts what the basket of goods that workers consume. Okay. And actually, I think what Marini does is he provides a degree of consistency to Marx, which was actually missing in the general law of accumulation. He explains how unemployment and so on, competition within the working class will render it more susceptible to this greater exploitation. Right, so we know about this in Marini. We also know about departments of production. I think I'm going to skip this now. What Marini does is he rethinks Marx's departments of production from the point of view of a very lopsided character of the forces of production in subordinated economies. In that, there's a very strong emphasis historically on the need to export-led growth, so-called, right? There's a very weak development of advanced means of production. And there's also a question of, okay, where is capital accumulating? Is it, and it's not just an economic question, that's a question of how the society is reproduced. So it's a question of a social reproduction as well. Marini is very conscious of these different elements. The one article I think that Marini explains this most clearly is, this is translation, it's not very hard in the Spanish, it's the same, pretty much, it's the ciclo de capital en economía dependiente, okay? Now, what Marini does is he takes this structure, which we're very familiar with from the first part of Volume 2, yeah, these circuits of capital, the metamorphosis through these different forms of an individual capital, right? And he looks at it from the point of view, what's that like in Latin America? And so the first phase, he says, well, the money investment, the buying of commodities, which sets up production, we got a lot of foreign investment. We've actually got a lot of state investment, he says, right? And what we find is that what's bought is the foreign influence goes into what's bought as well, because a lot of the means of production which we capitalists buy are actually foreign imports. So what we've got is an internalization within our production cycle, our movement of capital, of this international difference. It becomes internalized within our own economy, right? Within the capital cycle in Latin America, right? So this is interesting point of contrast to what we were discussing about Lenin and Russia. He's saying that the way capitalism developed, the industrialization, for example, in England in the 19th century, actually started with consumer goods. And then there was a fairly organic expansion into the production of means of production. And that's what he understands happened in England, for example. So first you had the cotton mills, steam engines. So clearly they're interdependent, but it's a question of, you know, the order of causality, I guess, right? So that's in contrast to Lenin's view about how capitalism developed in Russia. So it's a contrast. It's not necessarily, it's just different. Okay. And that's what he's saying. He's saying that the situation in Latin American dependent countries is different again from what happened in England, right? Because we've got a late industrialization. And when he's talking about that, he's saying in the bigger Latin American economies, I think from the middle of the 19th century, 1950-ish, I think, right? But there's an awful lot of the means of production are coming from outside, particularly the equipment and machinery. There is a development of luxury consumer goods later on, but there's also like a split. I mean, you think of the car industry. I mean, you've got your Mercedes-Benz and you've got your Volkswagens. They're different, but although they're both within the automobile industry in terms of what class is consuming them. Okay, manufacturing industry relies to a large extent on the capital goods sector of the advanced capitalist countries. That's what he's saying, right? So there was some limited industrialization, but even with industrialization, particularly in Mexico and Brazil, it's still dependent industrialization, is what he's saying. Okay, so dependent both in terms of the finance and in terms of the technology. So which brings him into the second, or if like the middle phase of this metamorphosis. And what Marini emphasizes here is the technological monopoly. The bigger companies work under privileged conditions. They have access to more advanced technology, and that allows them to gather extraordinary surplus value, to keep an extraordinary surplus value, I should say. And they are definitely dominant as a result. They can produce with better machines. They can produce, therefore, more cheaply. They can get more surplus value from the production than their competitors who don't have access to the latest machinery. And so there's a sort of a dynamic emerging between concentrated big capital and the medium and small enterprises. And he says even the small enterprises, this is another version of his compensation argument, which I think is quite compelling. He's saying this is the smaller enterprises compensate their lack of technology by forcing down wages. That's how they try to get back some of the surplus value which they couldn't get because they've got to produce at greater cost. But the only way they can cut that cost is by reducing the wages. And indeed, even the bigger companies, the more monopolistic companies, get advantaged if wages are cut, because they can also benefit from this, because you're talking about a class relation, and the industrial reserve army will grow in general as soon as these new techniques are introduced. So this is his argument here, and you can see he's working it through step by step. How does this work in Brazil, in Latin America? And then he's looking at the last phase of this cycle, which is realization, which is the selling of the commodities and the money coming back. And once again, there's a specific condition, which is what we've come to understand as the lack of consumption capacity of the workers. So he's saying there is an underconsumption in Latin America. The workers don't get paid enough to buy everything that's produced. And of course, that correlates because a lot of what's produced isn't for the home market, it's for export. Okay, so there's a correlation there. So what you have is the question of the profit, the M dash, the M prime, right? He's saying, well, quite a big chunk of that doesn't get reinvested because it goes overseas. And then some of it is reinvested, but some of it is also going to local luxury consumption. So he's saying all this adds up to structural reasons why we have such a highly concentrated income distribution, right? It's not just about, if you like, subjective factors about the sort of the power of the trade union movement and so on. It's a structural determinacy in terms of very high inequalities of income. I mean, even more so in terms of wealth, we could add, right? So he's bringing a fresh perspective to these departments of production. And what he's saying overall is they're different in Latin America than they are in Europe, right? And what we're actually producing is different types of commodities. You could think of the production, the means of production, as differentiated certainly between raw materials on the one hand and sort of machines on the other. But even further, the type of machinery that's being produced is different, right? And he says, well, this does change. I mean, we started off just producing raw materials capitalistically and foodstuffs, but there has been some limited industrialization. But in actual fact, a lot of commentators in the neoliberal period in the last 20 years or so are saying, well, actually, it's a reversion to reprimarization in Latin America. So there is no proportionality between the departments of production within the region. And if you think of it as a whole, it's a differentiated unity. Okay. But the point is that capital accumulation in the subordinated economies is not self-sustaining. It's highly distorted and dependent. That's the idea. And Amanda Latimer's introduction to dialectics of dependency sort of brings these points out, in terms of the political consequences of this from Marini's perspective. The similar view, quite independently as far as I'm aware, was reached by a South African theorist, Jaffa, who ended up in Europe. He was forced into exile. And this diagram, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can see the basic idea here is that you see VS, you might remember that's the product of the two departments, but he's saying as well as Department 1 and Department 2 in the imperialist countries, we have Department 1 and Department 2 in the colonized countries, okay? And then the flows of value are different, okay? So we've got a different way in which departments of production work, right? And he's saying this is not, again, he's saying this is to do with the actual structure of production. And you can't see it probably, but I'll just highlight it. He's saying that there are hidden flows of surplus value from the colonized part of the world to the colonizing or the imperialist part of the world. And that's his argument. His argument, this diagram is pretty detailed. His argument, I would say, is not so fully spelt out by Marini, but it's certainly very similar. Position he's taking, and of course they both reflect the reality, the continent of Africa and the continent of Latin American reality in terms of how they integrated or how they're subordinated in the capitalist mode of production. I mean, just flipping back quickly now to Marini, famous photo of him, and what do you see? You see he was a smoker, he had a moustache, he was a writer, big typewriter there, but something else I just want to draw your attention to. That there is the 3 volumes of Capital in Latin America. It comes out as 8 different books, 3 books for volume 1, 2 for volume 2, 3 for volume 3. Okay, right behind his head. I just think that's quite a nice little picture, right? I mean, Marini really knew Marx inside out. It's also clear he had read Luxemburg, Lenin, Bukharin, Rostolsky. So in this essay, which is actually more famous than the one I was just telling you about, extraordinary, the translation is not hard there, extraordinary surplus value in the accumulation of capital. I'm not going to spell this one out because it's actually quite a complicated essay, but he goes into what increases of productivity and extraordinary profits would look like in terms of the departments of production in Brazil. And he uses that to critique 3 other Brazilian theorists. His political thrust is actually, what I want to really say here, is that he's using this economic analysis to explain it's really, you can't see a way out. Within the capitalist system, you can't see a way out. So he's critiquing these other writers for their sort of reformist or apologetic interpretations of these great sort of distortion in the departments of production, the lack of integration of the departments of production, the lack of proportionality, he sees as being quite, what's the word, embedded, structurally embedded within Brazil's role in the world capitalist system. Okay, I'm getting close to the end now. I mean, I just want to say Marini's contribution is really, really important in terms of implying a rethink and a reworking of Marx's transformation in volume 3 based on different rates of surplus value. I mean, that's what that amounts to and what is associated with that. And I won't spend much time on that. I'm just going to now come on to the concluding type comments, right? There are quite a lot of mistakes, I have to say, in interpreting volume 3, and Marini didn't commit them. He didn't make the common mistakes, right? One of the mainstream positions is that there is consistency between volumes 1 and 3, and there is no contradiction. I think it's a misunderstanding of what's going on. There is a contradiction between volumes 1 and 3 because there's a contradiction in reality, right? Between commodities which are the products of labor and commodities that are the products of capital. And this is actually very important in terms of imperialism, because where labor is concentrated in the global south and capital is concentrated in the global north, this is the fundamental reality of unequal exchange. Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to skip those because of time. We can come back to those. The 2 readings that I recommend was one from Henrik Grossman and one from Marini, which I'll distribute in English. And the last page, in preparing this lecture, there's some recommended videos. And that else is what's coming. Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is the last of the lectures, and as you can see from the title, we'll be looking at how Marxist dependency theory used departments of production in volume 2, and there is an interesting link.
Okie dokie. I assume you remember all that. I don't find this very controversial, just in a general, from a general point of view. It just means that people weren't reading the literature on unequal or uneven development more closely. I think it does match the current state. It is not as earth-shaking as one might assume. It, I think, gives us the tools to assess, in fact, the current nature of the capitalist chaos that's going on. That is that the rich are getting richer, and they're doing it on all kinds of backs. They're taking advantage of migration issues. They are manipulating, of course, the differentials in wages. And I don't think that that's horribly controversial. It exists both in a in the level of north development as well as south development. And Brazil is an excellent example because it is, on the one hand, an advanced economy in the cities, but clearly an underdeveloped economy in the periphery, the center periphery argument there. And it's very interesting for all kinds of the usual reasons. And you can even inject current politics in that. You know, even though Bolsonaro is no longer in charge, some of the capitalist structures are still there. You know, and you can see manipulation at the superstructure level, right? You put your enemies in jail, like Lula, and you know, whatever. All of these things are structurally consistent. I think it's just a lag in thinking about lags. In fact, I think Higginbottom has the you know, this is the way in which the entire evolution sort of needs to go. That there was a stalling in you know, revolutionary fervor or activity that Luxembourg is responding to, and it's just the fact that we don't get enough translations of Marini, you know, that we have this issue. But it's important to identify it. I don't find it problematic to talk about super exploitation. I think that there are a variety of versions of it, or I think it's better to call it meta exploitation rather than super exploitation, because it doesn't differentiate itself that much when you get right down to it. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that you know, you have super rich certainly, and let's just say stuff needs to be taken down a peg, and that would be my overall interpretation of the problem. But that's just me. Are there don't get too lost, Nancy. There are ways to explain it. It actually has a I don't know if it's a simple exploitation, but it is a useful and consistent explanation, despite the fact that there are multiple interpretations of the matter. I've gone over my time, so and I've gone off the share, and I don't know if I have host now. So if there aren't any pressing brickbats interventions, denunciations, I'll stop this and we can get back to swearing. Let me point out that this is actually really important. This concluding lecture does actually combine all the issues. It's a good way to enter the conversation about volume 3. It sets up the argument that you know, is it or is it not consistent? That is volume 3 consistent with volume 1? And which is automatically solved. It's kind of a, you know, not it's a reasonable question, but I think one easily answered by the front, as I've said, front loading of volume 1 with many of 2 and 3's ideas. but not fully articulated or fully simplified. I know that sounds oxymoronic, but the fact is, it's all there. It's not that it's perfect or ideal, but it does spell out, I think, the whole path at which we currently exist. That is, there has been flexible production, globalization, differentiation at the regional or national level. Much of the issues about exploitation and dependency-oriented, the global South, is the what you see is, and what should be measured, with all due respect, is are questions that are actually fairly not anachronistic. They're a little dated, but they're very fundamental. That is, what is capital import export at the global level? And you can see what that is when you do the real work of enforcing the informal economy, that is corruption. If you can look at corruption with a clear eye, you can see what's going on. And my very simple example that I'll leave you with is how many oligarchs or billionaires are in the current or in the coming Trump administration. That alone should be able to tell you what the differentiation in between wages and et cetera. So, yeah, Anna has a very important point here. It's only a problem if you think of laborers' wages as an average. And the problem is there is differentiation of wages, but a lot of that is measured against consumption. That is your ability, consumer prices and your, to use a neoclassical term, the utils. The utils are different in Brazil than they are in America. Yes, I know there's currency exchange rates and blah, 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 but it is cheaper to live there and work there. That's why Glenn Greenwald is there, I suppose. It is nicer. The weather's better. There's more fun, perhaps, at least around Carnival and, other stuff. But the reality, of course, is that there's an entire little, quasi pseudo proto imperialist thing going on in Brazil between the periphery and the center, or the city and the country, raw resources in the interior and the coastal port cities. All of that's there. I mean, it would make it fun to study, and you can see the contradictions, right? Putting the Olympics, for example, in Brazil. An interesting example, only because it raises all of the contradictions. You can see it all there, moving poor people out, clearing suburbs, lots of corruption, all that stuff's going on. So anyway, I will cut off the live stream because I'm over time, and we can resume swearing again. Thank you very much. We will continue this yammering for a while. Oh, question? Comment?
Yeah, I was curious. Hudson has his, I don't know, it's like 10 suggestions or prescriptions. Those are sort of within, like, the US economy, I guess. Would any of those apply to this super?
Yes. Yes, they do. I would assert that they do.
Okay.
I think as a structural question, you can apply these at every different level. I would assert to you that the problems, and some people will just trash me for this, but I don't see the problems any different. They're just at a bigger scale and scope than in the 19th century. Certain things. And the certain things, though, are very key elements. That is, we're hunting around for lithium, we're doing other things, and it's really no different than the 19th century. We have more sophisticated means by which to do this. And the response to it, of course, at various levels is relatively primitive by comparison. Oh, well, we need to go back to the gold standard or blah, 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 And I don't even want to get to the point where we talk about the more peripheral yet stupid or distracting kind of questions like crypto or whatever. I'm going to come up with a thing about that soon, I think, on the difference between crypto or Bitcoin or whatever and quantum, because quantum will kill crypto at some point, and that's where the crisis will occur. But anyway, that's if you read today.